Okay, so welcome to the third and final part of our little series about what I believe religion to be. In our previous two episodes, we talked about the nature of religious concepts and the nature of religious groups. So if you haven't already listened to those episodes, I recommend you listen to those before listening to the one today, because today is going to be a continuation of what we spoke about in those two episodes. But the topic for the episode today is the nature of religious institutions. And I think actually if you want to understand religion as a worldly phenomenon, if you want to understand the kind of effects that religion has on believers, that it has on the world at large, then I think that institutions are probably the most important aspect of religion to study, and it's because it is at the institutional level that the effects of religion are most conspicuously seen. So, of course, the first question we have to ask is, what exactly is an institution? So there are many different ways to define this. When we think of the word institution, we might typically think of something like a school or a bank or some kind of formal social organization like this, and indeed schools and banks are institutions. But institution in a sociological context actually has a much broader meaning. And so when we are talking about institutions today, what we are talking about are basically repeated forms of social interaction that are enacted under some kind of social normative pressure. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but really institutions just have these two components. So firstly, we are looking for repeated patterns of behavior that are shared by many, most, or indeed all people within a particular group. So if you think upon the kinds of actions that you perform in a typical day, what you'll find is that a lot of the actions you perform are not really the product of free volition, in the sense that you're thinking about what you're doing a lot and making a free choice based purely on your own desires, but rather a lot of the actions that we perform are the product of certain rules or certain kinds of expectations that are imposed on us from the society in which we live. So if you think about something as simple as going to the shop to buy something, there's all these little patterns of behavior that we're expected to engage in. So we walk into the shop, we take the item off the shelf, we form a queue behind other people in front of the cash desk, we hand our money over to the cashier, we say thank you, she gives us a receipt, and we leave the store. So all of these little patterns of behavior that we enact every time that we go into a shop, we're not really freely choosing these every time we go into the shop. It's not like we find ourselves in a shop, scratch our heads and think, what would be the best course of action here? Rather, there are these little patterns of behavior that everybody knows they ought to enact every time they go into a shop. So all of these little things like forming a queue, handing over money, saying thank you, taking a receipt, these are all institutions because they are all, as I've said, repeated patterns of behavior which govern certain kinds of social intercourse within our particular groups. And what we can also note from this simple example is that there are different kinds of institutions in the world. So we can divide institutions into what we might call formal and informal institutions. So something like saying thank you to the cashier, this is an institution. Everybody does this. Everybody's expected to do this. But at the same time, there is no rule about saying thank you. There is no thank you police. It is not formally written down somewhere that this is what you have to do. So this would be an example of an informal institution. On the other hand, there are very strict rules governing the use of money, governing the payment of goods. These would be formal institutions. So things like laws, codified rules, certain kinds of Organizations like banks or shops, these are all formal institutions because it really is written down somewhere exactly how these things are supposed to work. But the second key component of institutions is not simply that these are repeated patterns of behavior that everyone engages in, but also that there is some kind of social normative pressure to actually abide by these institutions. So when you have an established institution, this institution is not just taken as a kind of recommendation, follow it if you want, but rather there is this very deep-seated expectation that if an institution exists, then basically everyone in the community ought to follow it. So if I wake up one morning and I think, I'm sick of this system of rules that I live in, so I'm going to go to the shop and try something a bit different, that's probably not going to end up too well for me. So if I break a formal institution, for example, and I decide, well, I don't really like money, so I'm just going to go into a shop and I'll take whatever I want, I'm not going to hand over any money, that's not going to end well for me. The police are going to be called, I'm going to go to prison. There is a very clear social cost to stealing things from a shop. But even when it comes to informal institutions like queuing or saying thank you, there's no rules which govern these particular institutions. But if I decide I don't want to follow them, so I just cut in the queue or I refuse to say thank you to the cashier, again, there are going to be certain kinds of social costs to that. People are going to attack me, the cashier is going to give me a dirty look. So even here where there's an institution that isn't formally written down, that doesn't have any kind of formal punishment attached to it, there are still going to be social costs to anyone who refuses to abide by them. So there are these two components to institutions, which is going to be very important for the rest of this episode to keep in mind. An institution is one, a repeated form of social behavior or social interaction. That is two, enacted under social pressure, and there are going to be social costs if you decline to participate in these institutions. Now, importantly, when it comes to institutions, there are certain, let's say, universal institutions which everyone in a community will be expected to follow. So we've already discussed things like saying thank you, using money. These are universal institutions. But critically, each particular group, each social group, also has its own set of institutions, certain patterns of behavior that you are expected to follow in order to be a member of this group. And it is indeed the institutions which define what a group actually is. So we talked about groups last time, and basically if you want to understand what a group is, there are things like identity that we have to think about. So being part of a group involves identifying with that group in some way and blending your personality with the group in one way or another. But critically, to be a coherent group, that group also has to have a certain set of special institutions which members of that group are expected to follow to the exclusion of others. And indeed, out-group members will typically not be expected to follow these particular institutions. So if we take something like a football team, I think I used this example last time, if I want to join a football team, there are certain patterns of behavior that I have to abide by. So I have to agree to come to training 2 nights a week. On match days, I have to wear a certain kind of uniform. I have to follow the rules of the sport and so on. And really, when you think about it, being a member of a football team is nothing other than the agreement to abide by these institutions. If I follow all of these institutions, so I go to training, I wear the right uniform, I follow the rules of the sport, then almost by definition, I am a member of the team. And if I refuse to follow these institutions, so I don't want to go to training, I don't want to wear that uniform, I don't want to follow the rules of the sport, then it's going to be made apparent to me pretty quickly that I am not going to be considered a member of that group. I'm going to be booted out. So critically, in order for a group to actually be a coherent group, there has to be certain institutions that in-group members are following that out-group members don't need to trouble themselves with. So of course, if you are not a member of this football team, you have no wish to be a member of this football team, then you're not going to wear the uniform, you're not going to go to training, you're not going to bother learning the rules of football, and so on. And so everything that we've just spoken about there, of course, applies to religions as well. When we talk about religious institutions, we are talking about repeated patterns of behavior that are performed under normative social pressure and which serve to define a particular religious group. So, as with ordinary institutions, religious institutions also can come in formal and informal forms. So, formal religious institutions are institutions which are somehow formally codified. So, you get formal institutions, for example, in sacred scripture, you get formal institutions in religious law. You have certain religious authorities like a church or some other religious body who have the power to create certain kinds of rules which everyone in the group is expected to follow. Then you also have informal religious institutions, which are certain patterns of behavior that members of a particular religious group will tend to enact. You can recognize a member of a particular religious group by some of these informal institutions, but these are institutions which are not written down anywhere. So they do sort of enter into the behavior of the group. People emulate each other, they copy similar sorts of behaviors, and these behaviors become signals to others in the group that indeed I am a member of this group. But these institutions are not written down anywhere. They don't exist as a kind of formal code or formal rule or anything like that. And as with ordinary institutions, the institutions of a religious group serve as the foundation of the group itself. So to count oneself as a member of a religious group basically just means a willingness to adhere to the institutional expectations of that group. If I want to be counted as a member of a particular religious group, I have to engage in the same kind of acts that everyone else in the group is enacting. And if I refuse to do this, if I decide I'm going to be a bit of a renegade and do things my own way, of course I can still give myself a religious label. I can still say I'm a Christian, I'm a Hindu, I'm a Jew, I'm a Buddhist, whatever the case might be. But other members of that religious group are probably not going to acknowledge me as a full member of that group, especially if I'm doing things that are diametrically opposed to the group's institutions, of course. But each religious group will have its own set of institutional expectations, some of which are stricter than others, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But even in, let's say, more lax forms of religious adherence, there are still certain things you have to do, certain things you have to say in order to be recognized by others as a member of that particular group. So if I wish to be a Catholic, for example, there are certain clear institutions that I am required to follow. So most obviously there are things like the sacraments, so there are particular ways to get married, to be baptized, to take confession, communion, to attend mass. So these are all kinds of institutions. If I wish to be treated as a Catholic, I'll probably have to respect these sacraments, to enact them when I have the opportunity. Within Catholicism, there's also what we might call institutional concepts. So there are certain kinds of concepts that I have to profess to believe in order to be considered a Catholic. So this is going to be things like belief in the divinity of Jesus, the Trinity, the resurrection of Christ, things like this. I will be expected to believe, and even things like respecting the authority of the Pope, treating the Church as the one true Christian authority on earth. These are also particular beliefs that are institutionally mandated by the Catholic Church. If I reject any of these beliefs, I'm going to have a very hard time being treated as a Catholic by other Catholics. There are also informal institutions in Catholicism, so things like, I've noticed a lot of Catholic football players who, when they step onto a football pitch, will cross themselves before running onto the pitch. This is not mandated anywhere, as far as I know, by Catholic law. The Church doesn't demand that believers do this, but at the same time, it's become a kind of institution. It's a way for a Catholic footballer to demonstrate to other Catholics that they are indeed a Catholic. And so this is a kind of informal institution that has sprung up within Catholicism from the bottom up. And it's also critical to recognize here that these Catholic institutions don't exist for fun. It's not like Catholics have created these institutions because they can't think of a better way to spend their time, but rather there is very definite social pressure for Catholics to be seen to enact these institutions. So at the formal level, if you repeatedly violate Catholic institutions, there is the very real threat of excommunication. You can literally be kicked out of the Church for refusing to follow the edicts of the Church. But even if matters don't escalate quite that far, there are still immediate social costs for a Catholic who refuses to respect the authority of Catholic institutions. So if I wish to be counted as a Catholic, but I don't get married in church, I don't baptize my children, I never attend Mass, I get abortions whenever I feel like it, I deny the divinity of Christ, I'm not going to have a very easy time getting along with other Catholics. They're not going to be very ready to put their arms around me and include me as a member of the group, because really my behavior is, in a very definite sense, undermining the group solidarity of Catholicism. So, as we've said, any religious tradition is essentially just a collection of institutions, and it's this shared commitment to certain institutions which creates religious groups. So, if Catholics decide that these rules are just a bit of fun, follow them if you want to, but they don't really mean anything, well, that's the death of Catholicism, basically. You can't have a religious group in which everyone is just allowed to do whatever they want, whenever they want. And of course, these observations don't just apply to Catholicism. Every single religious group, every religious tradition has its own peculiar set of institutions that every member of that group is expected to follow. There will be social costs to any members of that group who refuse to follow certain of those institutions, and it is these institutions which serve as the basis of the very religious group itself. So when you think about certain practices that are recognizably Muslim, recognizably Buddhist, recognizably Jewish, and so on, these should be recognized as institutions which serve exactly the same function as institutions in any other walk of life. So, in the case of religious institutions, as is the case with religious concepts and religious groups, there is no special religious way of being in the world, basically. The kinds of tools that we have at our disposal to understand religion are going to be very similar to the kinds of tools we use to understand any other walk of life. But having said that, there are certain special features of religious institutions which I think are worthy of attention, and which I think go a long way to explaining a lot of the more pernicious effects that religion can have on the world. So, primary among the special features of religious institutions is the tendency of religious institutions towards what I call institutional universalism and institutional totalism. So when I say that religious institutions tend towards universalism, I basically mean that religious institutions seek to spread themselves as far and wide as possible. I'll go into more detail about this at the moment, but basically institutional universalism just means this idea that religious institutions will attempt to spread themselves, universally. Institutional totalism, on the other hand, refers to the kind of institutional intensity of a particular religious tradition. So a truly totalizing religious tradition will have institutions for almost every aspect of human life. So in a truly totalizing religious tradition, you have institutions which govern everything from how you prepare food, how you have sex, what side of the bed you wake up on, what times you pray. Every aspect of your life can, in principle, be regulated by an institution in a truly totalizing religious tradition. So institutional universalism and institutional totalism, these are spectrums, so it's not like we can say that a religious tradition is just universalizing or totalizing. There are different degrees of this, so some religious traditions are more universalizing, more totalizing than others. And indeed, there are cases where you can have a religious tradition that actually doesn't have universalizing institutions, that doesn't have totalizing institutions. We will talk about these special cases at the end of the episode, so I don't want to sound dogmatic from the beginning and say that all religious traditions have to fit into my particular scheme, but I will say that if you want to really understand how it is that religion operates in the world, I think a good place to start is to look for these universalizing institutions and these totalizing institutions, because they do have very strong and typically very negative worldly effects, which we will discuss, of course, in due time. So we'll start with institutional universalism, and the simplest way to think about this, as I've said, is that a religious tradition will typically seek to spread its institutions as far and wide as possible, to see as many people as possible abiding by these particular institutions. And I've written down kind of a precise definition here just to make sure I get it right. So I've suggested that institutional universalism in a religious context involves, quote, the desire for a religious tradition to see its institutions followed universally amongst a particular community or a particular territory to the exclusion of competing religious institutions, end quote. So institutional universalism basically refers to a kind of institutional hegemony in which the institutions of a particular religious tradition are to be spread as far and wide as possible at the expense of competing religious institutions. So my argument here is going to be that this is not an occasional aberration in the history of religions, but actually that all religious traditions tend in the direction of exactly this kind of institutional universalism. That is, every religious tradition in some way seeks institutional hegemony over a particular community of people or over a particular territory. Now, again, as we will see at the end of the episode, there are exceptions to this, but we can start with the most obvious examples, the cases of Christianity and Islam. These are, I think, unambiguously and uncontroversially universalizing religious traditions. So there's not just the expectation that Christianity is good for Christians, that Islam is good for Muslims, but rather that these are faiths which should be realized globally, that it would be better if everyone on the planet was Christian, that everyone on the planet were Muslim. And you can see this in the history of these two traditions. They both have very long histories of violent conquest, of the persecution of minority religious traditions within their midst. And this can basically be explained, I think, or at least to a large extent, by the universalizing nature of the institutions within these two traditions. So when we talk about the spread of Christianity or the spread of Islam, these are not metaphysical forces, that they're not sort of magically spreading themselves over the earth. Rather, when we talk about the spread of these religious traditions, all we are talking about is the spread of their institutions. So when Christianity spread throughout Europe and extinguished the local pagan populations, what this involved basically was the imposition of Christian institutions and very strong social pressures to abide by these Christian institutions, so that, if you wanted to be included in the community, if you didn't want to suffer from persecution or violence, you had to get baptized, you had to attend church, you had to profess fealty to the church or something like this. So this is what the spread of Christianity means in practice. It doesn't mean that lots of people in Europe suddenly had the idea that, probably Jesus Christ is the resurrected Son of God. That sounds like a nice idea. Rather, there were very definite social pressures coming from particular political powers, but also from ordinary Christians, for people to follow these very specific institutions, and anyone who didn't follow these institutions would suffer very definite social costs. So again, the spread of Christianity, the spread of Islam, what we are talking about is the spread of particular institutions. And there is, I think, a very definite impetus within both of these traditions to try to evangelize the faith, to try to use political power as a means of imposing this faith on otherwise unwilling populations. So I don't think there's anything terribly controversial in suggesting that Christian institutions or Islamic institutions are universalizing in nature. But when I say that all religious traditions, or at least the vast majority of religious traditions, tend towards institutional universalism, I might pretty credibly be accused of treating Christianity and Islam as kind of normative religious traditions and forgetting about all these other religious traditions in the world that don't seem to have such global aspirations. So you might immediately think of a religious tradition like Hinduism, which is an incredibly pluralistic and heterodox collection of traditions, really. So this would seem to fly in the face of my claim that religious traditions tend towards universalism, and indeed throughout history, Hinduism basically has not spread beyond the subcontinent, so there isn't this globalizing impetus towards institutional universalism that you see in Christianity and Islam. But even here, I would suggest that there are pretty clear trends towards universalism throughout the history of Hinduism. So you have these various waves of what we might call religious centralization. So there's been, for example, the desire to impose Brahmanical rituals and traditions upon local Indian populations. So these are forms of Hinduism, particular rituals, particular institutions, which have been imposed by elite religious authorities on the local population. There has been the push towards Sanskritization, that is the imposition of a particular language and particular sacred texts on populations that previously maybe didn't make use of them. There have been quasi-monotheistic or monolatrous movements within Hinduism, such as Vaishnavism or Shaivism, which seek to impose the worship of one particular god above all others, and the suggestion that local gods that were worshipped in particular villages were actually simply avatars of these major divine figures. In the modern world, something like the Hindutva movement, this is an unambiguously universalizing movement. it seeks to privilege Hindu institutions and to impose Hindu institutions on the population at large, particularly at the expense of minority religious traditions, particularly in this case Islamic religious institutions, where really Muslims are being squeezed out of the national culture of India as this Hindutva movement imposes a very aggressive kind of Hindu universalism on the nation. So Hinduism, of course, is a pluralistic and heterodox religious system, certainly in principle, if not exactly in practice. But even there, even when you do have such a heterodox, pluralistic religious system, you can still have this tendency towards institutional universalism. And we should also be clear that institutional universalism doesn't necessarily imply that there has to be violence or illiberalism involved. I mean, typically that is the case, but it doesn't have to be. So if we examine the spread of Buddhism throughout Asia, there have been imperial conquests involved in this. Buddhist sanghas have been very good at allying themselves with local authorities, kings, and so on. So Buddhists have wielded a lot of power historically in places like Japan, Korea, China, and so on. But undoubtedly, a lot of the spread of Buddhism can be attributed to what we might call horizontal proselytism, which basically means that it's spread by people talking about Buddhism, by monks emigrating to distant lands and spreading the message of Buddhism. So you might say, okay, Buddhism is a kind of universalizing force, but it doesn't necessarily imply anything bad. The idea here is that, of course, Buddhist monks, lay Buddhists, they believe that Buddhism is the answer to a lot of life's questions, so they are going to be motivated to go out and to proselytize the message of Buddhism, say, and by this means, the institutions of Buddhism can spread. So yeah, this is also a kind of institutional universalism. The syncretism that is involved in the spread of Buddhism, this can also be viewed as a kind of institutional universalism. This is a particular strategy that a lot of religious traditions have actually used to spread their institutions. So in a situation where they realize that genuine institutional hegemony is, for one reason or another, not really achievable, there are syncretistic strategies that a religious tradition can use to still spread its institutions. So again, institutional universalism doesn't imply that there has to be violence involved, but we should be clear that we also don't want to paint this picture that a religious tradition spreads just because its ideas are so nice, that they are so clearly true, that, local populations are just going to pick them up without any sort of normative social pressure. So in the modern world, Buddhism has pretty clearly been enforced on local populations with a degree of violence. If you look at the situation in Sri Lanka or Myanmar, here Buddhist institutions have been aggressively defended at the expense of minority religious traditions, and there has been a degree of violence and persecution targeted at these minority religious traditions within Sri Lanka, within Myanmar. Again, it's typically the Muslims who bear the brunt of this. Within Buddhist majority countries, there is often a degree of social illiberalism involved in the propagation of religious institutions. If you go to Thailand, if you go to Sri Lanka, if you go to Myanmar, you're not going to get very far if you choose to denigrate Buddhist institutions. There is going to be the expectation that even if people don't necessarily see themselves as Buddhist, they are at least going to recognize the authority of Buddhist institutions, that they are going to respect Buddhist institutions, that Buddhist institutions are going to be propagated at the expense of competing religious institutions. So the point of all this is to say that we have to dispense with this idea that there are some religious traditions that are just sort of naturally peaceful, naturally gregarious, Rather, in particular circumstances, all religious traditions can involve a degree of institutional universalism, which does involve the hegemonic imposition of that tradition's institutions within a particular territory at the expense of all competing religious institutions. But even if I've been able to convince you that institutional universalism is endemic to these major world faiths like Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism, there are still some pretty obvious counter-examples in the history of religion which suggest that actually there are certain traditions that do not have this universalizing impetus. So a pretty obvious example here might be that of Hasidic Judaism. So here it seems like nonsense to describe this as a universalizing tradition because it forms a very closed community. And in fact, I think even if someone wanted to convert to Hasidic Judaism, they wouldn't really be able to, or at least it would be a very difficult and arduous process. So they aren't really looking to expand the size of the group in the same way that these other major world faiths are. Similarly, there does not seem to be the expectation within Hasidic Jewish communities that these institutions are to be followed by everyone else in society at large. So you don't have Hasidic Jews, I don't think, agitating for the imposition of Jewish institutions in the city of New York as a whole. In fact, it seems to be the case that the fact that these institutions are only followed by this very small select group is what makes them special. That they might somehow be devalued if they were to be adopted by everyone else in society. Rather, the fact that Hasidic Judaism is a very small, special, select group of people with institutions that do not extend beyond the bounds of that group. This can be a sign, actually, of the exceptional nature of Hasidic Judaism. So there are very strict boundaries of entry. Not just anyone can become a Hasidic Jew. There does not seem to be this desire to impose Hasidic Jewish institutions on other people. So this would seem to be a pretty obvious counterexample to my claim that religious traditions tend towards universalism. But this is why, when I gave the definition at the start of this section, I tried to emphasize that universalism does not mean globalism. It does not mean that a religious tradition wants to conquer the world, but rather every religious tradition can focus on a particular territory or on a particular community, a particular ethnic group, a particular linguistic group, and so on, and within that limited context, still aspire towards institutional universalism. So within the Hasidic Jewish community, there are a very strict set of institutional expectations that are imposed on members of that group. And within that particular community, the institutional hegemony of Hasidic practices is total. There is no room for any other kind of religious practices to exist within that community. If you want to be a Hasidic Jew and you start wearing a crucifix or a hijab or something, that's pretty much the end of your membership in the group. And moreover, if you want to be part of that group, you have to be very assiduous in the way that you abide by the institutional expectations of the Hasidic Jewish group. So here the kind of universalism that we're talking about is a very narrow kind of universalism. It only applies to a particular community, but still, within that community, these institutions are universalizing. They are to extend to literally everyone within that group. Anybody who dissents from these institutions cannot count themselves as a Hasidic Jew. But still, I might be accused of focusing a little bit too narrowly on contemporary religion. So if we look at the history of religions, in the ancient world, for example, or the history of more indigenous or autochthonous religious traditions throughout Africa, throughout South America, for example, you might suggest that a lot of religious practices here were not in the least bit universalizing. So if we take the example of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, there were actually a number of different religious cults, a number of different religious practices, each of which had their own set of institutions, which never really coalesced into a universalizing religious tradition. And certainly to be a member of one of these cults did not involve a commitment to the kind of institutional universalism that I've been talking about here. So if you were a member of the cult of Apollo, for example, in the ancient Greek world, this did not mean that you were out trying to proselytize for the cult, trying to expand the size of your group. It didn't mean that you were persecuting your neighbors who didn't worship at the cult of Apollo. Rather, there was a lot of leeway in Greek religion, similar in Roman religion, for people to commit themselves to particular cults, to the particular institutions within those cults, but there was never a kind of universalizing religious institutional superstructure in either of these two ancient states. But even here, although there was obviously a high degree of religious pluralism in a lot of these ancient societies, there were still universal religious expectations that were imposed on the population. So in ancient Greece, in ancient Rome, the denigration of the gods was obviously a big no-no. Even failure to pay due respect to the gods, to display no kind of religious behavior at all, these could lead to persecution. Remember that Socrates was put to death, at least in part for his aceibia, which translates as something like his impiety, his refusal to display due deference to the gods. In ancient Rome, foreign religious practices were often heavily persecuted or banned. There were certainly some kinds of religious institutions which were not to be permitted. So there was still something like what we might call a hegemony within Roman religion, even if that hegemony permitted a plurality of practices. That tolerance was not limitless. There were still certain kinds of practices you were expected to engage in, and certain kinds of practices that you were forbidden from engaging in. So this is a kind of tenuous form of universalism, I agree, but it still appears there. There are still very definite currents in ancient Greece, in ancient Rome, which pushed members of those cities, those societies, towards particular kinds of religious practices to the exclusion of others. And certainly the expectation was that you would demonstrate piety, you would demonstrate respect for the gods, even if in practice there were a number of ways that you could do this. So again, institutional universalism is a kind of spectrum. Obviously, some kinds of religious traditions are more obviously or stringently universalizing than others, and there are different forms that universalism can take. So I've mentioned that universalism can include things like syncretism, a kind of degree of religious pluralism. We won't go into the mechanics of that right here. I think that might actually make for an interesting episode in the future. But suffice it to say that even though universalism can come in degrees, even though universalism can take many different forms, my argument is simply that if you examine basically any religious tradition on the planet, you are going to see these currents of institutional universalism crop up time and time again. And I will stress once more that there are some kinds of religious traditions that actually do not really involve institutional universalism at all. These are very much, I think, minority religious traditions, but we will discuss those at the end of the episode. So hopefully I've been able to convince you to this point that institutional universalism is a common feature of most of the world's religious traditions. But let's look at what that actually means in practice. So when we say that a religious tradition has universalizing institutions, that tradition is going to have a number of features. Many of these features, I would argue, are pretty negative for the world. They really do have adverse consequences for the people involved in these traditions and the wider society at large. So the first feature of a universalizing religious tradition that we've already touched upon is this tendency towards institutional hegemony, and it should be pretty apparent why this can be a negative thing. If a tradition is seeking institutional hegemony, what that immediately implies is the desire to see competing institutions, particularly the institutions of competing religions, to be expunged from the community, to be ridiculed, to be derided, to be banned, and so on. And indeed, it doesn't just apply to competing religious traditions. One of the features of a number of contemporary religious movements is opposition to things like political liberalism, opposition to things like secularism, because really liberalism and secularism come with their own sets of institutional expectations, things we are and are not expected to do under these particular regimes. So any universalizing religious tradition is going to tend towards the hegemonic expulsion of these particular currents of thought from its tradition. And this explains why so many contemporary, particularly fundamentalist religious movements are so opposed to things like liberalism, including opposition to gay rights, opposition to transgenderism, opposition to secularism, this idea that church and state should be separate. That's also anathema to many of these religious fundamentalisms, and these are examples of the hegemony that is created by universalizing religious traditions. The second major feature of universalizing religious traditions is this tendency towards intolerance and violence and hostility directed towards religious outgroups, towards competing religious groups. And the reason for this is that if a universalizing religious tradition is seeking institutional hegemony, then by definition, the mere existence of another religious group, a group that has its own competing institutions, is going to be viewed as a threat. And when you look at the roots of a lot of religious violence, this is basically what it comes down to. Whose institutions are going to prevail, which are going to be enshrined in law, which are going to be followed by the majority of the population. This is at the basis of a lot of religious violence. So you can have a situation where you have two religious groups which are geographically separated, and they're probably not going to be too concerned with one another. And in fact, even in a pluralistic society, it's not necessarily going to bother someone if their neighbor has different religious practices to their own. But certainly, of course, there have been situations throughout history where this kind of religious pluralism has not been tolerated. But even if we look at the modern world, where there is probably more religious toleration than there has been throughout history, there are still conflicts that are created by different groups agitating for different kinds of institutions and fighting between themselves for access to political power. So you can see this pretty clearly, for example, in the way that Islam is demonized in both India and in the Western world. So in the Indian case, there has been a lot of violence directed against Muslim populations, particularly in the north of India, where mosques have been knocked down. There has been violence against Muslim beef sellers, for example, within the community. But generally, there has been this gradual push to exclude Muslims from civil society for the simple fact that they exist and that they are seen as a threat to Hindu institutions. So one particular form that this fear takes is the idea that Muslims are out secretly trying to convert Indians to Islam. Or that they are trying to marry Indian girls with the intention, again, of converting them to Islam. So within this kind of paranoid context in which Islam is viewed as a kind of essence that is spreading its tentacles throughout Indian society through its particular institutions, it means that a lot of Muslims within India really have suffered, and they are suffering not because they are going out aggressively proselytizing Islam or aggressively trying to convert people to Islam, but simply by being Muslim. They have been the target of attacks, they have been victimized by the government who is seeking to almost exclude them from Indian citizenship, and again, it's just this fear that Islamic institutions might spread at the expense of Hindu ones. And we see a very sort of similar paranoia in Europe, where there is this fear that Muslims are going to emigrate to Europe, that they are going to seek to impose Sharia law, that they don't really respect Western institutions. They are going to come in and erode Western institutions, including Christian institutions, from the inside out. And this explains a lot of the Islamophobia that exists in Europe. It's motivated by this idea that Muslims, again, are a kind of essence whose institutions are going to spread at the expense of local institutions. So you'll have Sharia implemented at the expense of domestic law, for example. So again, the point of all this is to say that if you have a universalizing religious tradition, the mere existence of competing religious institutions in any sort of proximity can be viewed as an existential threat, even in a situation where there is no overt threat that exists. The third feature of universalizing religious traditions is a tendency towards expanding the size of the group at all costs. So universalizing religious traditions will tend to have a lot of proselytizing programs. They will tend to have particular schools or other methods of indoctrinating children into the faith. Sometimes this can be achieved through, again, violence or through conquest. So again, throughout the history of religions, a lot of the spread of particular religions can be attributed to this desire to include as many people as possible under the notional label of a particular religion. So again, Christianity and Islam are the paradigmatic examples here. But even when you have a religious tradition that is not aggressively proselytizing, there is still typically this desire to see as many people included within the group as possible, that the world, that the community would be a better place if more people were following our religious institutions. The fourth feature of universalizing religious traditions is this tendency to aspire towards political power and to intersect with more secular worldly powers. So this relates to the previous example, where if you want to spread your religion over as many people as possible, it helps to have the support of a local political power who can help enforce these institutions over a population which might otherwise be reticent to accept those institutions. Access to political power is, of course, also very useful if you want to impose hegemony, which was our first feature of universalizing religious traditions. So if you want to impose a kind of institutional hegemony over a community, the best way to do this is to simply ban competing institutions or to mandate your own religious institutions. So again, if you want to achieve institutional hegemony, then access to political power, intersection with political power, is a very useful way to achieve this. And I would say that it is this desire for political power that is the most unambiguous signal of religious universalism, because you can find it almost anywhere throughout the history of religion, and certainly in the contemporary world as well. So in the ancient world, I mean, there was often no distinction to be made between religious and political authority. The high priests, these religious experts, had a huge amount of power over society, typically. The king himself was viewed as Pontifex Maximus, who had the sole duty of winning the favor of the gods, of overseeing religious practices, of ensuring that religious institutions were being observed, and so on. And this was a kind of symbiotic relationship that existed for the benefit both of the king and of the religion, of the temple, because, of course, when the temple has sole access to the king, this is a much easier way for it to spread its institutions, to ensure that competing religious institutions are banned and expunged from the territory, whereas the king, of course, gets this sort of authority or legitimacy from his intersection with religion, and of course, the priests and other religious experts are going to fall all over themselves in order to praise the king and to ensure that he is really seen as the legitimate authority within the nation. And it's exactly the same dynamic in the modern world. I mean, you look at the influence of Buddhism in Sri Lanka, you have a look at the influence of Hinduism in India, you have a look at the influence of Orthodox Judaism in Israel, the influence of Islam in Turkey, the influence of evangelical Christianity in the United States. Here you have these very close intersections of religious power and political power, where certain kinds of religious institutions are being privileged in all of these countries because you have a situation in which the religious traditions themselves have been willing to bend the knee, let's say, to assent to a particular kind of political authority, which works to the benefits of both sides. You have authoritarian leaders in all of these countries who gain a kind of legitimacy, at least in the eyes of the pious, and you have religious organizations which are able to impose their institutions on a nation because they have access to political power at the highest levels. But this is obviously an arrangement that can work out quite badly for the local populations, which brings us to our fifth aspect of universalizing religious traditions, and that is the desire to see its institutions imposed even on people who see themselves as beyond the religious group. So very often, particularly when a religious group has access to political power, they are seeking to spread their institutions not over willing adherence to the faith, but rather they are trying to see to it that even people who do not see themselves as members of that religious tradition should be obliged to follow these religious institutions as well. So in Iran, for example, where there is a very strict interpretation of Islamic law in place, every single woman in the country, whether or not they happen to believe in the tenets of Islam, whether or not they consider certain practices to be legitimate expressions of Islam, are required to wear some kind of head covering. So for more liberal or secular-minded women in places like Tehran, even if they do not believe in a form of Islam which requires them to wear the hijab, they are required to follow the institutions of this state-sanctioned form of Islam anyway. In Israel, there's been a lot of conflict recently between more Orthodox Jewish people and more secular-minded Jewish people. So one of the conflicts surrounds the issue of the Shabbat or the Sabbath, which is a religious institution within Orthodox Judaism that a particular day should be set aside as a day of rest, in which no form of work whatsoever is to be undertaken, and in which you also should not oblige anyone else to work for you. So the Orthodox contingent within Israel believe that much of society, including trains, buses, cinemas, what have you, all of these things should be shut down on the Sabbath. whereas secular-minded people, of course, would prefer these services to keep operating. But from the perspective of the universalizing Orthodox contingent, it doesn't matter whether people actually wish to be part of this institution. It doesn't matter whether or not people wish to see themselves as included within the Orthodox Jewish group. They should still be obliged to observe this day of rest. And so these services should not just be closed down or inaccessible to Orthodox Jews, but to literally everyone in Israel. Everyone in Israel, according to this universalizing Orthodox mindset, should be obliged to observe this Orthodox Jewish institution of the Sabbath. In the case of the United States, there are, of course, religious fundamentalists who believe that all Americans should be obliged to follow the particular moral commandments of what they see as the Christian faith. So there's a very strong institutional commitment, particularly in evangelical Christianity, that one should oppose abortion. So the goal is to impose laws which mean that no woman in America, irrespective of her religious commitments, is permitted to get an abortion. This is an example of a universalizing Christian institution being imposed on people, even those who might not want it. Similar examples, you've got things like the posting of the Ten Commandments in schools or at courthouses. You've got this push to reintroduce biblical education to schools, things like this. These are also examples of universalizing religious traditions in Christianity that Christian fundamentalists and political conservatives in the US are attempting to push onto people, even people who do not see themselves as within the Christian faith. And the sixth and final aspect of universalizing religious traditions is something a bit more benign, but I think it's still important to mention, and that is that universalizing religious traditions tend to make their doctrines and practices very open to the public at large. So we basically know what Muslims believe, what Christians believe, what Buddhists believe. All of their doctrines are available in particular texts. We know exactly what practices they engage in. All of these practices are on full public display. And this is important to mention because there are forms of religiosity which are not open in this sense. And again, this is something we will talk about a bit later in the episode. But it's a pretty important diagnostic criteria for not just universalizing religious traditions, but for anything that can truly be counted as a religious tradition. So it is in fact enshrined in UK law, as far as I understand it, that in order for something to be classified as a religion, it has to be open about its particular beliefs and practices. So quasi-religious movements like Scientology, which are much more secretive about their beliefs and practices, would, at least under this definition, be excluded from the category of religion. So certainly a universalizing religious tradition, but I would argue any religion worthy of the name, also has to have this quality of its doctrines and practices being transparent and open to the public. So those are some of the features of universalizing religious traditions. As I've said, I believe that these sorts of features are endemic to basically all of the world's major faiths and plenty of the more minor faiths as well. So one thing I would advise you to do is when you're looking at some of the more illiberal aspects of religion in the world, think about how these might relate to institutions and think about how these might be examples of religious institutional universalism. It comes up again and again that if you want to understand the behavior of religious individuals or religious groups, why they are doing what they are doing, very often it relates to this desire to see particular religious institutions enacted and observed in a kind of universal way. So universalism is the first aspect of religious institutions. The second aspect is that of totalism. So when I talk about institutional totalism in a religious context, I'm talking about institutions which are particularly intensive and broad and which involve many, many aspects of a person's life. So as I mentioned before, a totalizing religious tradition is a tradition in which almost every aspect of a person's life is intimately regulated by particular kinds of institutions. So there are social pressures, there are explicit religious laws which tell people things like how they are to prepare food, what kind of food they can eat, what sort of clothes they should wear, how they should pray, how they should copulate, how they should use the toilet even in some cases. So almost every aspect of a person's life can, in principle, be subject to institutional expectations within a religious tradition. And basically, the more rules there are, the more aspects of a person's life that are regulated by particular institutions, the more totalizing that religious tradition is. So, as with universalism, religious totalism is a kind of spectrum. There are some traditions that are plainly more totalizing than others, and there are different ways in which a religion might be totalizing. So perhaps the most obvious example of totalizing institutions in a religious context is the Jewish halakha, or the set of laws that Orthodox Jews are expected to follow. There are a number of these laws. They are very specific. They govern many, many different aspects of a believer's life. And we can illustrate this just by looking at the rules which exist within the halakha for preparing food. So these are laws which are typically referred to as kosher laws. And these are institutions which govern almost every aspect of diet. So they involve, for example, the kinds of foods which Orthodox Jewish people are and are not permitted to eat. They govern things like how different foods are to be prepared and certain ways in which they are not to be prepared. They govern the way that particular animals are to be slaughtered before they are to be eaten. They even govern the kind of crockery which may be used in the preparation of food, so different kinds of foods require different kinds of crockery in order for them to be prepared. And so these are examples of very intimate institutions which govern in very fine detail the kinds of behaviours that an Orthodox Jewish person is and is not permitted to do. So the Jewish halakha, taken in its totality, would be a fairly clear-cut example of a totalizing institutional regime in a religious context, because there are very few aspects of an Orthodox Jew's life that is not in some way subject to one or another of these particular institutions. A weaker form of institutional totalism can be found in Catholicism. So here there are certain institutional expectations which are placed on all Catholics, and we've already discussed some of these. So things like baptism, marriage, attending Mass, participating in the Eucharist. So all of these things are expected of Catholics, but obviously these are rules which don't intimately govern the lives of Catholics in the same way that the halakha of Judaism does. So there aren't really any strict pronouncements in Catholicism about what believers are to wear or how they are to prepare food. So it's not as totalizing as the halakha in Judaism. But if we go past these sort of formal pronouncements, there's still a very totalizing aspect to Catholicism, which leaks into the personal behavior and the personal ethics of Catholics. So certainly to be a Catholic, there are certain kinds of behavior like fornication, like wearing contraceptives, like being gay. All of these kinds of practices are to be excluded from a Catholic life. There are also other, we might say, less formal institutions in Catholicism, which again govern how a Catholic person typically behaves in the world, but these are not codified. They don't govern one's life quite so intimately as the halakha in Judaism or the sharia in Islam, for example. And we might even think that we can identify, explicitly non-totalizing forms of institutions in religion. So, for example, in Protestant Christianity, there's this really antinomian streak, which has occurred for pretty obvious historical reasons during the separation from the Catholic Church. But we might say to ourselves that in Protestant Christianity, there are actually pretty few institutional obligations that are imposed on the adherents of the faith. So there are certain, formal institutions, things like baptism. I mean, you would still get married in a church, for example, if you're a Protestant, but beyond these fairly rare life events, Protestantism doesn't make too many explicit demands of its followers. There aren't so many formal institutions in Protestantism which govern the lives of its adherents in any sort of intimate way. But at the same time, I want to stress that there still exist within religious traditions these informal institutions. So even if no Protestant church officially says that to be a member of this church you must follow these institutions fastidiously, there are still a number of informal institutions, again, which govern the personal conduct of believers in pretty intimate ways. So even though there aren't any explicit laws against it, a Protestant, again, is going to look askance at things like fornication. Protestant fundamentalists might reject particular secular institutions in favor of religious institutions. So they might, for example, refuse to watch secular movies, refuse to watch secular literature. There are certain ways that people within evangelical Protestant communities are expected to speak, the way they are expected to worship, even the way they are expected to dress, maybe even the kind of foods they eat in some extreme cases. So here there are no formal institutions which dictate that Protestants have to do X, Y, or Z, but there can still be strong social pressures for a Protestant Christian, particularly an evangelical or a conservative Christian, to behave in certain ways, to adhere to certain informal institutions that all of his or her peers are abiding by as well. And that anybody who fails to observe these particular institutions is going to face some kind of social sanction. People are not going to welcome them so openly into the church. They can be readily ostracized. So evangelicals who are gay, evangelicals who vote for the Democratic Party, things like this, they are going to have a hard time fitting in with a number of evangelical churches in the United States. So again here I want to stress that I believe that institutional totalism is a defining feature of basically all religious traditions. So as I said, there are weaker and stronger forms of this, informal and formal forms of this, but all religious people are going to be expected to enact their religiosity in particular ways in a wide variety of circumstances in their life. You can't really pick and choose the times in which you'll be a Christian or a Muslim or a Hindu, say. Rather, this is something you have to enact at every moment of your life, and there are institutions which govern exactly what you are to do as a Christian, as a Muslim, as a Hindu, and so on, that you face very real social pressure to abide by. Now, the first question that might pop into your mind is why anybody would actually be motivated to pursue such a stultifying form of religious adherence. So if there are more liberal possibilities available to someone in which they have more freedom over their choices, why would they actually submit to a totalizing religious system? Well, in the first place, particularly if that religion happens to be a universalizing religious tradition as well, there very often isn't an element of choice in this. So if everybody in your community is expected to abide by particular institutions, then it doesn't really give you much scope for choice. If you grow up in an Orthodox Jewish household and you decide that kosher isn't really for you, well, that's going to really make your social life very difficult, to put it mildly. Probably you will be excluded from the group. So there are very distinct social costs for refusing to abide by totalizing institutions. That's a strong motivator for people to pursue them. But we should also be clear that actually a lot of people, I think, enjoy this aspect, if that's the right word, of religious adherence, this understanding that you have certain very clear-cut duties. It's always made apparent to you what you should be doing with your time, what you should do in any particular situation. And I think, honestly, a lot of people don't actually value freedom in the sense that we might understand it, because freedom also can be kind of terrifying. You know, if you're thrown into a situation, you don't know what to do, you don't know what the right course of action is, you don't have any guideposts, that can be pretty scary. So there are people, I think there is a certain sort of religious fundamentalist temperament which exists, which is maybe a bit more neurotic in nature, a bit more closed to novel experiences, things like this. And people with these kinds of personalities are, I think, going to be drawn towards totalizing religious institutions because it spares them the embarrassment or the fear of not knowing what to do with their lives. And there have also been studies done on new religious movements. I think the most famous studies relate to kibbutz in Israel. So these are these sort of self-organizing religious communities which are self-sufficient and autonomous in nature. And studies have shown that the most successful kibbutz are those which actually have the strictest rules. So if you set up a kibbutz that is fairly liberal in nature, it's very easy for people to sort of free ride in this situation, to get away with whatever they can get away with, and if they don't like it, it's very easy for them to walk away. Whereas if you are a member of a less liberal kibbutz in which there are lots of expectations placed on you, then that's going to form, I think, a stronger kind of group cohesion, this sense that everyone is in it together. And this is an example of what has been called a costly signifier in the study of religion. So basically, there are certain kinds of religious practices which are actually very difficult or onerous or even painful to perform, but when people perform them, it demonstrates to everyone else in the group their commitment to the group. So it's very easy for someone to say, yeah, I'm a member of this group, I'm a committed member, you can count on me. But, words can be cheap, but if you are performing very difficult actions that come at a great cost to yourself, you're really signifying to everyone, hey, I'm in this for the long run. I'm really committed to this cause, because someone who is half-hearted about the religious group wouldn't be motivated to perform these actions at a great cost to themselves. So that's why it should be no surprise that these studies have found that less liberal religious communities tend to last a lot longer than the liberal ones. So there's almost a kind of evolutionary pressure at play here, which is simply that for a religion to survive, for a tradition to maintain itself as a coherent group, it's in a way pushed towards these sort of totalizing institutional demands, because that is one of the most effective ways to hold a group together. So if you have a religious group that has been successful for a very long time, institutional totalism might be a strong reason for that. And that could be one reason why we see that most of the world's religious traditions today involve at least some aspect of institutional totalism. Institutional totalism within a religious group can also be promoted through the use of particular concepts or the deployment of particular emotions, which can motivate people to keep particular rules, to adhere to particular institutions that they might otherwise see as somehow arbitrary or not worthy of consideration. So if you can tell someone, for example, that the particular institutions that they are following are not the product of arbitrary human decisions, they're not accidents of history, but rather they have been codified by a particular deity, or that they are simply somehow written into the fabric of the cosmos. This would be the Indian concept of dharma, for example. then that's a pretty strong motivation to abide by these institutions, because if you fail to abide by them, then you're not just letting yourself down, you're not just letting the community down in some way, but you are violating the very will of God. And if you truly believe that these institutional duties have been set down by God and that your commitment to God demands that you abide by these institutions, well, that's going to provide a pretty strong intrinsic motivation on top of the extrinsic social pressures to abide by these institutions. And another aspect of this is that these institutions are not simply presented as certain laws that you have to follow, but they are charged with a high degree of emotional salience. So the performance of a particular ritual, the wearing of certain clothes, the eating of certain foods, these can be charged with a great degree of emotion, particularly moralized emotion, which again serves as a kind of intrinsic motivation for someone to abide by these institutions. So the easiest way to do this is to moralize religious institutions and to cultivate, therefore, in believers a sense of guilt or a sense of shame when these institutions are not followed. So if you ask yourself, for example, why you don't leave the house in your underwear, I mean, you can confabulate any sort of number of justifications for this, like, oh, I don't want to feel cold, I don't want to get sunburnt, whatever it is. But really the reason that you don't go outside in your underwear is because you would feel naked. You would feel a great degree of shame about walking outside in this state of undress. And the reason for this is that you have been conditioned into this by the society in which you live, where it is made very clear to you from a very young age that when we go outside, we wear trousers, we wear a dress, whatever the case might be, and that there is therefore something intrinsically wrong about going out of the house in your underwear in this state of undress. And so if you want to understand what motivates, let's say, a Muslim woman to wear the hijab or the burqa, it can be something as simple as this. I think that they have been conditioned into believing that to go outside with their face, their hair exposed, is a sign of nakedness. It is something to be ashamed of. And after a certain while, they simply internalize this emotion. They police themselves. They cannot leave the house in that state of undress for the same reason we don't go outside in our underwear. When you think about it, both of these positions are equally irrational. I mean, there's nothing disgusting or morally objectionable about human hair or the human body. So, why don't we go outside without a hijab? Why don't we go outside in our underwear? Well, it's simply because we have been conditioned into recognizing that this sort of behavior is inherently shameful, and this feeling of shame, not wanting to be looked down upon by other people, is a very strong motivator to follow these particular institutions. The institution of the hijab, the institution of wearing trousers. So, while I do want to stress on the one hand that there isn't anything particularly special about religious institutions, that if we want to understand how religious institutions work, the kind of effects they have in the world, we don't need to treat religious institutions necessarily as a special class. General social and psychological factors surrounding how it is that we embody institutions and follow institutions will also be sufficient to understand religious institutions. But I would at the same time stress that religious institutions are not just a set of benign practices, but that they also possess certain features which mean that they are liable, in my opinion, to introduce some very negative consequences into the world. And we can break these negative consequences down into the kinds of negative consequences that religious institutions can produce for individuals, and the kind of negative consequences that religious institutions can produce for society. So, from the individual side, the negative effect of religious institutions can most obviously be felt in their illiberal nature. So, as we've said, there are certain social pressures for people within a religious community to enact religious institutions, but sometimes those pressures can spill over even onto people who do not consider themselves to be part of the group. So there are these sort of social forces which impose religious institutions even on unwilling individuals. So this kind of social illiberalism that really stultifies the freedom of individual people. This is the most obvious negative consequence of religious institutions. But even if we take a more charitable view of religious institutions and we say that people are choosing to enact these institutions not because they are being forced to, but somehow because they want to, because they endow these practices with a degree of meaning, that these practices grant them a sense of purpose, and so individuals really are choosing to enact these institutions. But even if we take this view, there are still some negative consequences, I think, for individuals within a religious community. So we've already said that the emotions are a strong intrinsic motivation for people to abide by religious institutions, but the flip side of this is that religious practice can therefore instill what I would categorize as pretty maladaptive emotions into individual believers. So believers might, for example, feel a lot of fear about properly enacting particular religious institutions. They might feel a sense of shame at their failure to properly enact particular institutions. They might feel a sense of disgust at people who follow different practices and so on. And all of these are very strong, very negative emotions. I mean, there is a reason that human beings have these emotions. They do serve a function, they do have their place. There can be good reasons to feel fear or shame or disgust. I'm not suggesting that we should be striving to feel good all the time. But at the same time, these emotions do have their time and their place. And I think that religious practice can stir these emotions in believers, even in completely inapt situations. So the Muslim who feels an acute sense of fear about going to hell because she has engaged in haram activities, or the Christian who feels a deep sense of shame at engaging in premarital sex, or the Hindu who feels a profound sense of moral disgust over anyone who eats beef. I don't see these emotions as being particularly adaptive. I think that these are dispositions which can pretty clearly get in the way of living a comfortable, happy, and contented life. You can ask a lapsed Catholic, for example, just how deep these emotions can run. So even when someone who is brought up in the Catholic faith decides later on in life that they don't agree with the doctrines of Catholicism, that they have no further wish to be engaged with Catholic institutions, these very strong moralized emotions that their Catholic upbringing has instilled in them can be much more difficult to jettison. So you might have a Catholic who still has this sense of existential fear about going to hell, a sense of shame about their sexuality, a sense of disgust about particular practices that they were taught were anathema to the Catholic worldview. These very negative, very maladaptive emotions can persist in the mind of someone who has consciously rejected all of the beliefs and practices associated with Catholicism. So these emotions, these habits, are really so deeply ingrained in believers that it becomes very difficult not to have a strong and, as I said, maladaptive emotional reaction to things in the world which, to be honest, are not of any great consequence. But I also don't want to give the impression that all believers are filled from morning to evening with these horribly negative emotions, and that it is these emotions which are driving their religious commitments. Because actually, I think there are many, many situations, perhaps the majority of religious institutions that are enacted by believers are enacted not in a state of high emotional arousal, but rather purely through habit. That believers enact particular institutions because they have simply been acculturated or habituated into enacting these institutions until enacting the institutions becomes second nature. It becomes almost a kind of reflexive muscle memory. So when a Muslim woman wears a hijab, or a Jewish person prepares a kosher meal, or when a Christian footballer crosses himself before running onto the pitch, they are not performing these actions because they are being commanded to. They're not performing these actions because they would feel a strong negative emotional reaction if they were to not perform these institutions, though that, as we've said, can also be part of it. But rather they do these activities because they did these activities yesterday, because they see their cohorts performing these activities, and so these activities are just sort of ingrained in them. They become part of that person's nature. Much the same as any other daily activities that we perform without really thinking about it. You know, going to the shower, brushing our teeth, these sorts of banal daily activities. We don't consciously think about them. We certainly don't typically perform them because we feel some kind of fear or potential sense of shame or disgust if we don't perform these actions, but rather it's just, okay, we've woken up, it's time to brush our teeth. That's what we did yesterday, that's what we did the day before. We do it quite unreflectively, I think. It's just what is done. So a lot of the time when we're looking at religious institutions and why people follow them, I think that a very useful concept to invoke here to explain all this is Pierre Bourdieu's concept of habitus. So habitus is basically, well, as the name would suggest, the sense of habit that is ingrained into us from an early age by the practices of the people around us. And for Pierre Bourdieu, there is not necessarily anything negative about this habitus. In fact, it's sort of a necessary fact of how we get along in the world. So going back to our earlier example about the institutions involved in going to a shop and buying something, all of the practices involved in that process, as we said, are performed largely unreflectively. So when I walk into a shop, I know exactly what it is that I am to do. I know that I am to queue. I know that I am to pay money to the cashier. I know that I am to say thank you. But all of these practices, all of these institutions are ingrained into me to such an extent that I can perform these actions completely unreflectively. I would almost say unconsciously. It's very rare that we go into a shop and we have to make a conscious decision. Do I queue or not? Or, well, should I pay for these things or not? Rather, it's just sort of automatically performed. We just automatically do these things because these practices have been ingrained into our very being, into our very bodies. So our bodies can enact these institutions effortlessly without much conscious reflection. And so the positive side of all this is that it means in familiar situations, we always know what it is that we are to do. We don't have to worry about going into a shop and feeling lost, feeling unsure about what to do, because we have inherited these institutions from the people around us, and we basically just absorb these institutions and we enact them. And it means that in most familiar social situations, we don't feel a sense of anxiety or uncertainty because we know what is expected of us. The only time that this breaks down, of course, is when we enter into new situations, or if we travel to a different country, or if we attend some kind of venue that is completely unfamiliar to us. Then, of course, in these situations, we are going to feel a little bit uncomfortable. We don't know what to do with ourselves. We're going to be looking to other people to try to, give us advice or tell us what to do. And I think we can all agree that mostly these sort of situations are unpleasant. It never feels good to be uncomfortable, to feel out of place, to be uncertain about what to do. So this is what Habitus provides us with. It just provides us with these basic impersonal practices that everyone can share, which permit us to get along in the world in a much more comfortable way. And when we talk about religious institutions, so these are, as we've said, universalizing and totalizing institutions. So they don't just tell us what to do in particular situations, but they tell us generally what we are to do with our lives. They could potentially structure almost every minute of your day, so that there is always some institution, some religious institution, associated, at least potentially, with everything it is that you do with your time. And as we've said before, this can be a great comfort to a lot of people. There are a lot of people for whom I think the world is a terrifying place. I think that genuine existential freedom for them is a terrifying thought. This thought that really everything we do could potentially be a product of choice, that there is nothing about the nature of the universe which must compel us to perform one particular kind of action as opposed to another. I think a lot of people are really uncomfortable with this. I think that a lot of people do prefer to have very structured days where in every aspect of their lives they know what is expected of them. They know what to do. They are able to go about in the world with a set of institutions that they can depend on, that they can enact without any sort of anxiety or uncertainty, and so it helps them in a way to feel more at home in the world. But the negative side of this for me is, well, as I've already intimated, by doing this you are basically giving up your existential freedom. So you are saying that the things I am going to do in the world, the things I'm going to do with my time, these are not the products of choice. I'm not really responsible for the things I'm doing. I'm just doing them because this is what is commanded of me. This is what is expected of me. So in a very literal sense, your actions become inauthentic. Inauthentic in the sense that you are not the author of your own actions. You are not responsible for the things that you do because you believe that the choice has been taken out of your hands, that you have to follow these institutions because your religion demands it or because your God demands it, and therefore you can believe that you are not really responsible, you are not the author of the things that you do in the world. And you can see this especially clearly in the way that so many believers are eager to self-essentialize themselves, so to believe that they carry some intrinsic essence of, say, a Christian or a Muslim, and that this essence compels them to act in one way rather than another. So you'll hear things like, well, as a Christian, I believe X, Y, Z, or well, as a Muslim, I'm obliged to do X, Y, and Z. So here, these obligations are completely illusory. There is no such thing as an essence of a Christian or an essence of a Muslim. Certainly no people really possess these essences. Rather, their religious commitments, their decision to believe in some particular thing or to do some particular thing, that's really the product of choice in a way, again, assuming that they haven't been forced into these behaviors against their will. Then every belief or every behavior that a believer engages with is really a product of choice. If a Christian believes that homosexuality is a sin, they are not compelled to believe that because they are a Christian. They do not have a Christian essence which forces them into this particular belief. Rather, it's a belief that they have chosen. If a Muslim says that she is only able to eat meat that has been prepared according to halal specifications, again, she might believe that this really is something that is out of her hands. It's something that's been commanded of her, that it's part of her essence as a Muslim to follow these practices. But again, really, it's just a choice. If you choose to take halal specifications seriously, then that is your choice, really. You could have chosen otherwise. So I think it's very, very inauthentic of believers to essentialize themselves in this way and to imagine that the institutions that they have chosen to follow are somehow inescapable and that therefore they cannot be criticized for them, that they shouldn't be made to take responsibility for their behaviors. I think that this is, as I've said, a very inauthentic mode of existence, and I really don't understand, on a very personal level, what would compel someone to choose this form of life over a more authentic form of life where you can really recognize yourself as the author, the sole author of your own actions. When we look at the negative effects of religious institutions at a broader social level, again, the most obvious place to start is the illiberal nature of religious institutions. So particularly, again, the way that religious authorities, when they attain a degree of political power, will often seek to impose their institutions on even unwilling members of the population. So the Taliban in Afghanistan, the Shia regime in Iran, the Christian nationalist regime in the US. These are all examples of illiberal political systems that have been informed by the desire of a religious authority to impose their particular beliefs and practices even on people who do not consider themselves necessarily to be part of that religious group. But beyond that, we can again point to the emotional salience of religious institutions and look to the kind of negative social effects that this might have. So one area that I would focus on here is that because religious institutions are tethered to these highly moralized emotions, I think it makes it difficult sometimes for a religious community to have a sensible degree of moral proportionality, if that makes sense, when it comes to leveling moral judgments. So if you have vested particular religious institutions with such a high degree of moral emotion, then that's going to make it more difficult, I think, for that community, the community who practices these institutions, to level sensible moral judgments. So if you say, for example, that blasphemy is a major sin, that fornication is a major sin, then there's going to be the danger that you are going to fixate on these particular issues, which to me don't really have any real moral valence. I mean, no one is hurt if you use God's name in vain. No one is hurt through consensual fornication. But if you are a believer who takes these institutions surrounding the holiness of God and surrounding the impropriety of premarital sex very seriously, then you are going to take violations of these institutions just as seriously as you are going to take violations of unambiguously moral issues. So you get statements like Aquinas said this, and Jesus, I believe, said it in the Bible, that blasphemy is a worse sin than murder. That is almost an established Christian doctrine, but that, to me, is utterly ridiculous. If somebody genuinely believes that to use God's name in vain is a crime as serious, or more serious, in fact, than running a knife through someone and killing them, then I really question your ability to get on in the world. I really question whether it is possible for other people to properly trust you, to share in a society with you, because that signals to me that your main concern is not morality per se, it's simply upholding particular religious institutions. And as soon as the upholding of religious institutions becomes more important in the mind of a believer than morality simpliciter, we have a pretty big problem. And this is, I'm sure, something that we will talk about in a future episode, but this is what we might call a perverse effect of moralization in a religious context, that if every violation of every one of God's commandments is charged with such a degree of moral seriousness and a high amount of emotion, then you get some pretty perverse effects in the world. People doing horrible things in the name of God, and not just believing that these acts are acceptable, but that these are morally salutary. But this is a whole issue in itself. I'm sure we'll come back to it again in a future episode. I think that another major negative effect that religious institutions can have on a society relates to the way in which religious institutions can serve to undermine social cohesion. So, I think that the primary function of totalizing religious regimes is, as I have said, to maintain group coherence, and the problem with totalizing religious ideologies is that they seek to clearly distinguish, to make a clear boundary between the religious group and the wider society. So this can lead to a kind of atomization of society in which particular religious groups might not see themselves as belonging to the wider society, or that they might even view the wider society as a kind of polluting influence on them. And, that's going to have some pretty clear repercussions for things like social cohesion, because we're setting up some pretty clearly defined in-groups and out-groups based on pretty arbitrary practices, and I'm not sure why secular society should find anything at all to celebrate in that outcome. Now, just before we finish up here, I'm sure that a lot of people have maybe come to the conclusion that I'm being a bit harsh on religion here, or that I'm selecting some particularly lurid examples to illustrate my point. But people might argue, look, religion is not just about these totalizing and universalizing institutions. It's a kind of spiritual pursuit. It's about improving us as people. Not all religions are as illiberal or violent as I might have portrayed them to be here. So certainly there is some truth to that. And to explain why, though, we need to look at different institutional forms that a putative religious tradition can take. So I have insisted here that religions tend towards totalizing and universalizing institutions, but it can't have escaped your notice. In fact, I've already pointed this out a couple of times already. There are religious traditions that do not seem to be universalizing or totalizing in this way. And in fact, I agree, not all what we would typically refer to as religions have to be universalizing or totalizing. There are religious traditions that involve totalizing institutions, but not universalizing institutions. There are religious traditions that involve universalizing institutions, but not totalizing institutions. And there are indeed religious traditions, if that name is appropriate, that contain neither, that they might not have any sort of totalizing or universalizing institutions, or indeed no recognizable institutions at all. And so while I would reserve the name religion proper only for those traditions that actually have universalizing and totalizing institutions, I think it is worthwhile considering these other forms of religiosity, which, even though I'm not inclined to call them religions proper, obviously they share a lot in common with what we would uncontroversially refer to as religious traditions. So let's think, for example, of a religious tradition that might have totalizing institutions, but not universalizing ones. So in this case, we are thinking of a tradition that has a lot of intensive institutional expectations that are placed upon members of that religious group, but at the same time, they have no interest in spreading these institutions. They have no interest in proselytizing, they have no interest in intersecting with political power in order to expand the size or the influence of this group, and very often they persist in sort of deliberately obscured conditions, hidden away from the rest of the world, which they very often view as a kind of polluting influence. So these kinds of religious traditions I would refer to not as religions proper, but rather as cults. So some particular examples of this might be the Amish community in Pennsylvania, where they have a very closed community. They are not interested in inviting outsiders in. They have no interest in engaging with political power to expand the size or the influence of the group. They don't expect non-Amish people to follow the same institutions that they do. But at the same time, to be a member of the Amish community involves a lot of intensive institutional commitments. So the Amish have this totalizing institutional aspect, but they don't have the universalizing one. So that, for me, makes them a cult rather than a religion proper. In other cases, you have isolated religious communities which don't want to proselytize or to advertise their existence for the very real threat of persecution. So, as I understand it, the Ahmadiyya population in Pakistan, who are a kind of messianic Islamic group, they have been persecuted by Pakistani authorities. They've been targeted by religious fundamentalists within Pakistan. So it's therefore incumbent upon them to remain relatively secret about their practices, not to advertise their religious group, not to seek political power or to proselytize, because that's an inherently dangerous activity for them to engage in. We might classify many of the religious traditions in the ancient world as cults for similar reasons. So here it's not necessarily that the cults in ancient Greece or ancient Rome wished to remain secretive, although some of them, to be clear, did, these so-called mystery religions that we know very little about. Again, in some cases they remained mystery religions for fear of persecution. In other cases, they might have remained mystery religions in order to maintain their sense of exclusivity. They didn't just want to invite any old person along to be a member of the group. But in these ancient religious cults, it was normally pretty clear to members of the cult what they had to do in order to be a member. There were particular rituals, there were particular rites they had to perform. But at the same time, there wasn't necessarily an interest in expanding the size of the group, in stealing members from other cults, or imposing the cult on the entire community at large. So again, these can be viewed as religious groups with totalizing institutions. There were a number of ways in which someone's life was intimately affected by their institutional commitments to these ancient cults, but at the same time, there were no universalizing institutions because, for one reason or another, ancient religious cults tended not to be interested in expanding the size of their group or the influence of their group. Then we can have putatively religious groups which appear to have universalizing institutions, but not totalizing institutions. So in some ways, these are actually kind of incoherent, because what this group would appear to be aiming towards is a sort of universal influence of its institutions, but at the same time imposing no serious institutions on its followers. So on the face of it, this seems like a pretty impropitious way to found a religious tradition. Like, what kinds of institutions are you spreading if you don't really make any strong institutional demands of your members. But I would argue that these sorts of forms of religiosity really exist, and I refer to them as identitarian movements. So what typically happens in an identitarian movement is you have a religious label, a notional religious label, like let's say Christianity, and the idea is going to be to spread the power and the influence of those who view themselves under that religious umbrella. But at the same time, it's going to be a very broad church, and anybody basically can count themselves as members of the group. There's nothing in the way of institutional expectations or ethical expectations that are going to see you excluded from this group, but at the same time, the group does exist in order basically to further its own power, its own influence, and so on. So because this is the nature of an identitarian movement, that it's seeking to spread itself as far and wide as possible, you very often find identitarian movements intertwined with political power. So as one example, we might look at the Christian lobby in the United States, who are pushing for the advent of what they refer to pretty vaguely as Judeo-Christian values in the United States. There is a pretty clear idea that these so-called Judeo-Christian values, we might say institutions, are to be privileged over all other forms of religiosity, so that only Christianity should be officially sanctioned by the US government. But at the same time, to be a member of this movement requires very little in terms of personal institutional commitments. I mean, you can view yourself as a member of this group and not attend church. I mean, someone like Donald Trump is at the head of this movement, and the guy is clearly a bigger atheist than I am. Not because he sat down and thought about the issues, but he just simply couldn't countenance the idea that there exists an ego in the universe bigger than his own. So he is someone who in no way embodies Christian institutions. He has no interest in abiding by Christian institutions, either formal or informal. He certainly doesn't abide by the moral duties typically expected of conservative Christians, but at the same time, he is the head of this identitarian movement, which seeks to promote Christianity, however vague and empty that word might be in this case, at the expense of all other religious institutions. Similarly with the Hindutva movement in India, basically anybody is permitted to be part of this group. There are no special religious demands or institutions that members of the Hindutva movement are expected to follow, but you certainly at the very least need to reject Islam. But as long as you do that, and as long as you promote Hinduism, however vaguely defined, over all other religious traditions, you too can be a member of the Hindutva movement. We see similar dynamics in many former communist countries where you have these autocephalous churches who are intimately entwined with governments. So the easiest example of this is the Russian Orthodox Church and its alignment with Putin, where again there is the promotion of Orthodox Christianity, and a lot of people within Russia, particularly Russian nationalists, identify as members of the Orthodox Russian Church, even though things like church attendance and the observation of specifically Russian Orthodox practices is catastrophically low in that country. I think I read that it's something like 80% of Russians identify as Russian Orthodox, but only 8% of Russians actually attend Russian Orthodox churches. So again, this is an identitarian movement where people seek to identify themselves with a particular religious label. They seek to spread the influence of this particular religious group at the expense of all others. but it comes with very little in the way of personal institutional demands. It doesn't matter if you actually attend a Russian Orthodox church or not, you can still count yourself as a Russian Orthodox Christian and seek to promote the interests of this group over all other religious groups. And I think that this is also a useful category for understanding the recent public statements of people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who has come out and said that she is converted to Christianity as a former atheist, and Richard Dawkins, who now apparently describes himself as a cultural Christian. Now, these are people who, as far as I can tell, don't hold any specifically Christian beliefs. They haven't exactly come out and said that they've been overwhelmed with evidence for the resurrection. They don't necessarily even believe in God. They certainly don't engage in any specifically Christian practices. But in both their cases, I think they've been motivated by a particular kind of fear of competing institutions. So certainly in the case of Ayaan Hirsi Ali, she has a fear which is, to be fair, relatively well-founded about the excesses of Islam. And so I think she views Christianity as a kind of bulwark against the propagation of Islam in Western Europe. And Richard Dawkins, I think, has a fear, but maybe of Islam as well, but certainly of wokeism, however that's to be defined. And again, he views cultural Christianity as a sort of conservative bedrock of ideas that can be used to challenge a lot of these novel, progressive political ideas. But in both of their cases, as I've said, they don't appear to be committed to any particular Christian institutions. There are no Christian institutions they enact in their lives, but at the same time, they want to see Christianity as a kind of vague and empty concept to be promoted at the expense of competing institutions like the institutions of Islam or the institutions of wokeism. And finally, of course, we could have a putative religious tradition that appears to either have no universalizing and no totalizing institutions, or indeed no institutions at all. Now, this is a kind of religiosity which you might find in, let's say, very individualized forms of religiosity. So you might have someone who is genuinely, seeking out a personal relationship with God. They're going on a kind of individual spiritual quest, and this doesn't involve recourse to any particular institutions. They might believe certain tenets of certain religions. They might engage in certain religious practices, but they don't see themselves as beholden to any particular institutions. They're simply going to pick and choose the institutions they wish to follow, those institutions that are going to promote in some way their spiritual quest, but otherwise they don't see themselves as members of a religious group, and they certainly don't believe that they have any particular religious duty to follow specific religious institutions. Now, this form of religiosity I would refer to as spirituality, and this is, I think pretty uncontroversial actually, because in a lot of the scholarly literature there is often this distinction made between spirituality and religion, the difference being that religion proper involves a degree of institutional commitments, whereas spirituality seems to be largely extra-institutional in nature. So examples of this would be movements like, let's say, the New Age movement, where there's a sort of vague body of ideas and practices that are involved in the New Age movement, but really, if you want to be part of this movement, you can pick and choose which things exactly you believe, you can pick and choose exactly which practices you wish to engage in. No one is going to put any kind of social pressure on you to engage in the right practices. So yeah, the New Age movement would be an example of spirituality as I've defined it here. A lot of very liberal religious traditions like the United Unitarian Church, which doesn't really push any particular dogmas on people. It doesn't have any rituals or practices or institutions which are endemic to it or that you are required to follow in order to be a member of that church. Again, this I think would be an example of spirituality in practice, but most spirituality, as I've said, is a very individualistic pursuit. Typically, a spiritual person is someone who sees themselves as engaged on a quest to commune with God, to be a better person, something like this, as I've said, and therefore they don't necessarily have any need for any overarching institutions. Now, I think when a lot of people are extolling the virtues of religiosity, it's often this sort of religiosity that they have in mind, this idea of individuals pursuing God, trying to find meaning in their lives, trying to find answers, and so on. And in truth, spirituality is going to be the most benign form of religiosity, simply for the reason that, as we've said, universalizing and totalizing institutions can have a number of negative worldly effects. So therefore, any form of religiosity which lacks these kinds of institutions is, at least to that extent, going to be a more irenic, a more benign form of religiosity. But I would also add that certainly throughout the history of the world, I think even in the Western world today, that spirituality vis-a-vis religion proper is still very much a minority religious position. In the Western world, as church rates decline, but things like belief in God or belief in some higher purpose tend to persist. This can be viewed as a kind of transformation from a religious society into a more spiritual one. But certainly we shouldn't imagine that spirituality is this pure form of religion, that this is really what religion should be, because actually this form of religiosity, when we look at the historical record, when we look around the contemporary world even today, is very much the aberration. Most forms of religiosity have included robust institutions which are universalizing, which are totalizing, and that this explains many of the horrors that religion has caused in the world since time immemorial. And I should finally stress here that no particular religious tradition is confined to any one of these categories. So if you have a particular religious tradition, a particular religious group, if it is a religion at one moment in time, so we define it as a religion because it has totalizing and universalizing institutions, it doesn't mean it always has to retain that form. So as I've said, I think in the Western world, mainline religious institutions are in a kind of decline. A lot of churches are refusing to make very strong institutional demands of their adherents, perhaps because, we live in fairly liberal societies in which the sovereignty of the individual is to be respected above all else. So any religious tradition that comes preaching you must do X, Y, and Z maybe is not going to be very successful in a Western context. But the point is that it's not like you have Christianity and Islam, which are just always religions, because you can also have identitarian forms of Islam and Christianity, you can have cultic forms of Islam and Christianity, and you can have spiritual forms of Islam and Christianity. So in the Christian case, we've already said there are unambiguously, I think, universalizing and totalizing forms of Christianity that would constitute a religion proper. An example would be Catholicism. Then you can have forms of Christianity which have totalizing institutions but not universalizing ones. That would include the Amish, as I've mentioned. Then you can have Christian movements which have universalizing institutions but not totalizing ones. That would be Christian nationalism as we see it in the United States. Then we can have more spiritual forms of Christianity which have very weak institutions or no institutions at all, such as the United Unitarians. Or you might have Western Buddhists, for example, who insist that, Christianity, Islam, these are religions, but actually Buddhism is a kind of spiritual practice. Well, in the Western context, that might well be true, but throughout history, throughout much of the Buddhist world in Asia at the moment, that is ostensibly not true. There are very robust institutions involved in the practice of Buddhism, and these can't be downplayed. You can't simply say Buddhism is inherently a form of spirituality, because for most of its history, at least according to my definitions, that simply hasn't been true. Or we could look at the case of evangelical Christianity in the United States and say this is pretty unambiguously a religion, but I would say actually that the moral demands, the institutional demands imposed on evangelicals in the US has actually weakened significantly, particularly since the election of Donald Trump, where apparently moral failings, it's not just that they are no longer to be condemned, that these are no longer reasons to be excluded from the church, but I would almost say that these personal failings are now celebrated within evangelical Christianity. If you swear, if you are abusive, if you bully people, if you are a serial adulterer, well, who cares? As long as you are promoting the interests of the evangelical Christian group over all other religious groups, you can basically do what you want. So this might represent a transformation from evangelical Christianity, at least in the United States, from a religion proper into an identitarian movement. So why does all of this matter? Why have I spent so long talking about religious institutions? Well, the point I wish to stress here is that we often think about religions as kind of this spiritual, metaphysical contemplation of the universe. We often treat it as a kind of otherworldly phenomenon, but I want to stress that religions are a worldly phenomena. They are motivated by very material factors. They are intertwined with the world of flesh. And it is at the level of institutions that these otherworldly ambitions and speculations of religion actually intersect with the world in which we live. So if you want to study the particular positives or negatives of a religious tradition, then it's not going to do you much good to pore over its doctrines. You know, doctrines are just words. These are abstract concepts. They are very much focused on the heavenly realm, the unseen realm, as opposed to the worldly realm in which we actually dwell. But when you look at institutions, these are nothing but material facts. Every institution is a worldly fact. There is absolutely nothing otherworldly or spiritual about, for example, attending Mass or going down on your knees and praying or wearing a hijab or obeying kosher law. These are distinctly material processes. And so as material processes, these are the kinds of things that are going to have an influence in the world, as opposed to these flighty abstract doctrines, which can be interpreted in myriad ways, and which, frankly, I don't think have very much influence over the behavior of particular adherents, because again, there are multiple ways to interpret them. It's very easy to ignore or downplay doctrines which are inconvenient for you. But in the case of institutions, it's incredibly clear what your duties are. It's incredibly clear how they are to be followed. Everyone in the tradition is abiding by the same practices, or at least notionally they should be. And so anytime you want to examine the negative worldly effects of religion in particular, I would again stress, don't look at the doctrines of a religious tradition, look at the particular institutions that the adherents of that tradition are interested in abiding by, and the kinds of ways in which those institutions are imposed on people, both within the faith and without the faith. And I think that when you recognize that so many religious institutions have this universalizing and totalizing impetus, that explains a hell of a lot about the negative consequences of religion in this world. Okay, and so with that, we finally come to the end of this episode, and we finally come to the end of our three-part series discussing the nature of religion as I see it. So hopefully that didn't test your patience too much. Hopefully you've been able to get something out of this. Hopefully you now have a better idea of how it is that I view religion. So I apologize if all this has tested your patience, but as I said, I wanted to kick off this channel with a fairly clear and thorough statement about what I believe religion involves, so you will have a better idea of where this channel is coming from, and why I hope it will be a bit different to the normal fare that you get on atheist podcast channels. So thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you'll tune in again next time. So thanks very much. Goodbye. See you soon.